Good afternoon. It's January 18th, 2021. I am acknowledging that 3 years ago today, I submitted a series of reports following events that had transpired after I had spent some time sleeping overnight in a assisted living environment in Houston. It was a facility that provided housing for people that had either some form of disability or had a special need. It was public housing that was part of a public private partnership. And these things are very common these days, more so than they were at a period of time in the past. And there are people in numerous places that have a need for such a facility. They often involve waiting lists that can be quite extensive. So, if you're somebody that has a need for such a housing situation and you've been put on a waiting list, it can be something else when it comes time for you to be able to have access to the possibility of staying in a place like this. My understanding is these places can be temporary. Hopefully, in the case this one I understood had a 2 year limit without a special exception, with the understanding that at some point you were going to get permanent housing. And in the meantime, there were a variety of rules and a variety of expectations in exchange for the sorts of accommodations you would be provided. It was one of those facilities that had a security setup where they had somebody that worked a desk 24 hours a day in shifts. And if you wanted to bring guests in, your guests had to check in at the front and they had a procedure. Now, by and large, the procedure in these places for guests, in my experience, has been that once you enter, you have to show them your identification card and then you sign in. Now, at pretty much every other place I've ever been with such a arrangement, you show them your ID card once, and if they make a notation or they do something with your ID card, including writing down information in the logbook, they give it back. This place was different. Every single time you entered, they took a photocopy of your ID. They scanned your ID into a networked printer that was in the room across from where the person at the desk sat. And they made a photocopy, and then they put the photocopy of your ID in a folder by the side of the desk. And everybody who was on site at the time, who had a guest pass to be there because they were there with somebody in that facility, would have their photocopy of their ID in that folder the entire time they were there on site. And when you left, you let them know, they signed you out, and then they presumably destroyed that photocopy. So every single time you came, you had to make a different photocopy. Not only that, if you wanted to stay overnight, you could, but the person was limited to 3 overnights a week. And each time there was a $5 deposit, $5 payment. You had to pay $5 for that person to be able to stay with you overnight. Now, I became concerned because at this time I was homeless. I was on the street. I had a person who I was hoping was a friend of mine, a very nice person who had a particular disorder called neuropathy and also had a heart condition. The ironic thing is, she was very young, about my age, and had previously been employed as a paralegal and had family that was in the legal community. She had had a brother who was a noted criminal defense attorney, and he had a very mysterious medical condition that resulted in his death, rather recent to a medical event she experienced that caused her to have these sorts of symptoms regarding her heart condition, and that had her identified and diagnosed as disabled for the purposes of being able to attend to what needed to be attended to, and as a result was eligible for this kind of facility. I became concerned because every day that I would stay at her place, they would take this photocopy. And when I stayed overnight, every night I was running scenarios and I tracked it. See, I used to work at the Department of Public Health in San Francisco. And when I worked there, one of the things we had to deal with is going through a 10-year peer review of all of the photocopiers that were networked in that specific department. I know what the contracts can look like. I know what some of the processes are. I know what the cash records can look like, how you can look up. There's a specific code. There's a print record of every single printout, photocopy, and scan. Networked photocopiers are networked for a reason. The question is, in whose network is that photocopier? Because these overnights I was working were not during the night where they were being executed. And so while I would sleep there, I would be conscious of all this activity. And in the morning, I would wake up and they would take that photocopy and they would tear it up. I asked them, can I keep this photocopy? So when I come, I can just give you the photocopy. No, we need to make a new one every time. So you need a new record. You need a new transaction identification number every time I'm on site. And every overnight, well, I calculated. And you were not allowed to let somebody stay overnight for what would amount to more than 40 hours a week. They didn't want to pay overtime to whoever the derivative assignment was. That was my understanding. It would have been 36 hours was the maximum amount you could have somebody on site in your place overnight per week. Now, I tracked, as I said, the activities that I was cognizant of while I was on site, especially in the overnights at that place. Sometime later, a year later, after I'd had to deal with other things, and she and I didn't speak for a while, I ran back into her and she told me something. This is what she told me. There was an old warrant. She had previously been able to prove that the charge was baseless. It was an old warrant that got called the weekend before Valentine's Day of 2018. She was in a hearing at court after she had spent 72 hours in jail on a fake warrant. She was in court in the hearing on the morning of Valentine's Day of 2018 in Houston. Today's 3 years since I filed that report with New Hope Housing, Disciplinary Committee for the State Bar of Texas, Houston Police Department, Texas State Troopers in Austin, Houston Children's Museum, Texas Department of Public Safety. There's another one on here that has an acronym. Today's 3 years. None of them have gotten back to me. Those overnights ended up in Afghanistan. They ended up in Iraq. They ended up in Lebanon. I felt it. I heard it. They co-conspired to arrest her before Valentine's Day. I contend they absolutely knew I sent that package to the Department of Justice. They obstructed and interfered in it, and they had her on site in a courtroom while I was doing my lab for non-destructive testing so that they could call that fucking school shooting in Florida. Teach somebody a lesson. Did you guys think you were qualified for the teachers' retirement system benefits that the Railroad Commission in Texas is hooking up? If you don't get back to me by 5 o'clock today, every single one of you defaults to me. You're bankrupt.